Greetings and salutations. I'm Larson Halleck, and welcome back to another riveting edition of Moviebob's Psychotic Breakdown, aka Super Mario Bros. 3 Brick by Brick. Before we begin, though, let me clear up a few things. First of all, Bob is not a very good writer, so, unless otherwise noted, any weird grammar or syntax or punctuation that I say in the recordings is Bob, not me. And without further ado, here's more of the story. Part 1. A Brief History of Mario. Press start. By now, the legend of Mario's creation is old hat to the fans, but those who didn't grow up marinating in the game culture stew would likely be surprised at the utilitarian simplicity of his origins. Today, we're used to receiving our cultural icons only after a lengthy process of focus testing and demographic charts, particularly video game personalities, who must often bear the weight of cross-cultural expectations. Japanese games frequently see their androgynous heroes transformed into hyper-masculine forms to better appeal to Western tastes, and navigate the minefields of socio-political symbology. Just what is the proper length of a skirt between sexual empowerment and pandering male fantasy? Mario, on the other hand, came about the old-fashioned way. A character was needed, and one was made in the best form available from the tools available. And rather than a marketing team or a team of demographic analysts, Mario sprang from the mind of one man, Shigeru Miyamoto. Today, Miyamoto is a living legend, the starry-eyed iconoclast of the video game industry, spoken of by other designers, less like a man and more like a mysterious sorcerer that walks amongst the mortals. But once upon a time, he was just one among hundreds of men and women toiling in the nascent days of the game industry, doubtlessly too hard at work to even consider that their every tiny success and failure might be laying the foundations of a new medium and a new form of art. Miyamoto's backstory is a mix of iconic and humble, almost perfect enough to render him as a character in one of his games, a precocious youth with a love of art, music, and wilderness exploration, who dreamed of growing up to be a mangaka, Japanese comic book artist. Instead, he found himself working for Nintendo, a toy and playing card company that had moved into the video game industry, with mixed results. So goes the story. Nintendo's most recent game, and Miyamoto's first role as part of a design team, Radar Scope, had failed to replicate its popularity in Japan when it came to America. The head of the company's newly established American branch, the nephew of the company's CEO, was stuck with a surplus of unwanted arcade cabinets, and the decision was made to rewrite the game's programming into something new, so that the unsold units could be reprogrammed and the cabinets resold. The task of conversion fell to Miyamoto, an unconventional decision given that he was primarily an artist and a designer with little experience as a programmer, but one that would prove fateful. He was given very little to go on, just the requirement that all the programming be built from the existing parts of Radar Scope, and an early suggestion that Nintendo might be able to secure the license for Popeye. When that fell through, he had to develop new characters and a scenario. In doing so, he made history. For the first time, a video game's characters and story were being developed before the interface. The early Popeye brainstorm had naturally called to mind the scenario of rescuing olive oil from the villain Bluto, and had fixed in Miyamoto's mind the idea that players would be enticed to keep playing by the goal of having to rescue the girlfriend rather than simply get points for their own sake. Simple and archetypical though it may have been, this would be the first time that a game engaged players at all through any sort of narrative and emotion. Bluto was replaced by a gorilla, Donkey Kong, which in turn suggested the girl abducted by ape finale of King Kong, which in turn suggested the gameplay of scaling a building in pursuit of an ape. But the game needed a main character and avatar for the player. It needed a hero. In keeping with his desire for the game to have characters as well defined as the hardware could allow, Miyamoto wanted his hero, who he was still considering calling Mr. Video, to stand out within the game, to have recognizable human movements and a face, and while video game graphics of the day placed severe restrictions on ambitions, a clever artist could find a way. And so Mr. Video got a big Italian-style mustache to give his face and nose definition in profile, and he would wear overalls so his arms would be visible against his body. They would call him Jumpman at first, but he soon got a new nickname based on his apparent similarity to one Mario Siegel, a real estate mogul who was Nintendo of America's landlord at the time. The finished game, Donkey Kong, was a smash hit, and Mario was born. Miyamoto would revisit the character soon after in 2 Kong sequels and Mario Brothers, a 2-player co-op game reminiscent of Joust that introduced Mario's brother Luigi and gave them a new backstory as New York City plumbers, combating an infestation of crabs, bugs, and turtles in the pipes. Nintendo, fueled largely by the success of Miyamoto-developed games, branched into the home video game market, which had collapsed in the US but was thriving in Japan, and the ability of these family computer or Famicom games to be longer and more complex led Miyamoto to expand his new character in an unprecedented way. The Golden Age. The title told the tale. Super Mario Bros. Was Mario Bros. Blown up to epic proportions. Instead of one screen, the gameplay would now be spread across an entire world that scrolled from left to right in the inaugural example of a genre that would dominate the Golden Age, the side-scrolling platformer. Mario and Luigi wouldn't simply be crossing the screen, they would pass through a whole world. Different skies, different terrains, underworlds, even swimming underwater. And this world would need more characters and stories to populate it. Mario gained the ability to grow to giant, or super size, via magical mushrooms, eventually leading the fairy tale inspired kingdoms of castles and magic beanstalks that was being devised. Precisely how the Mario Bros. Got there from New York City is the subject of much debate, to be named the Mushroom Kingdom. The hostage rescue scenario from Donkey Kong was revived with a new damsel in distress, Princess Peach, whom Western audiences would know as Toadstool for more than a decade, and the turtle enemies of Mario Bros. Were expanded into an entire race of creatures called the Koopas, a reference to Kappas, turtle-like demons of Japanese mythology, ruled over by the wicked Bowser. Mario and Luigi would traverse 8 worlds split into 4 levels each ending with the conquest of a fortress, and all but the last, teasing the player with a rescued hostage who would inform you that the princess was in another castle. The success of Super Mario Bros. Was immediate and overwhelming, the kind of electrifying impact that only ever happens once or twice in the lifespan of a medium. In its native Japan, the game served as an eye-popping send-off for the original Famicom, as Nintendo shifted focus to an upgraded disk system version of the device. But in the West, the game was the trigger for something much bigger, a full-on resurrection. While home gaming on machines like the Famicom were popular in Japan, game consoles had been dead in America since 1983, when a weary consumer base and quality control issues caused the industry to collapse in on itself. The entire industry thought Nintendo was insane for trying to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System, but the naysayers were caught slack-jawed as the NES became an instant earth-shaking mega hit in 1985. And it was Super Mario Bros. The game was sold with early versions of the system that propelled that momentum. As Nintendo went on to become synonymous with the medium they had saved from the dead through most of the 80s and 90s. In Japan, Mario returned immediately in Super Mario Bros. 2, essentially a slightly tweaked, much more difficult version of the first game, but it was judged too difficult for American gamers and too visually outdated by the time it would reach US shores. It would ultimately be released there a decade later as The Lost Levels. Instead, the decision was made to convert a then newer Miyamoto game, Doki Doki Panic, into America's Super Mario Bros. 2, by redrawing its 4 main characters as Mario, Luigi, Toad, the Mushroom Kingdom citizen like those rescued at the end of the 7 worlds, and Princess Peach. The American Super Mario Bros. 2 divides fans to this day. The radical shift in tone, style, and gameplay were explained away in the plot as Mario having a strange dream, but it was responsible for many of the series' now standard elements, chief among them recasting Luigi as a slimmer, taller brother, rather than a palette-swapped twin of his brother, and adding enemy characters like Shy Guys and Bob-Ombs to the Mario canon. What can't be argued is that the game's release coincided with Mario's ultimate ascent to pop culture godhood. Between the release of this American sequel and Super Mario Bros. 3, our main subject, Mario and his cohorts would appear in a deluge of successful television series, spin-offs, and licensed products. His face adorned posters, birthday cakes, and Happy Meal toys. Children dressed as him for Halloween, and they scrawled the titles of his game onto letters to Santa. In 1989, the impending release of Super Mario Bros. 3 was considered an event of such incredible magnitude that an entire feature film, The Wizard, was produced on the pretext that kids would catch mere moments of gameplay during the climax. The game itself would go on to be, for a long time, the best-selling game ever. That was the high point of Mario Mania. Life in wartime. In 1990, Mario once again led Nintendo into a new age as the ambitious Super Mario World, or Super Mario Bros. 4 in Japan, became the flagship title of Nintendo's new Super Nintendo. And while the game was a major success, now remembered as a classic of the genre, and for introducing Yoshi the Dinosaur, one of the series' most popular characters, this was the beginning of the end for Mr. Miyamoto's plucky plumber, as the unquestioned king of all video game heroes. Although it wasn't fully apparent to all gamers, neither Nintendo nor Mario were the only game in town. They had major competition in Japan, and game-friendly home computers like the Spectrum and Commodore 64 were more popular than the NES in Europe. While the NES dominated North American sales and Mario lorded over gaming's cultural image, they had a persistent challenger in the form of rival console purveyor Sega, whose Master System had eked out a serviceable existence as the Brand X NES, and whose Genesis beat the SNES to the 16-bit punch by a couple of years. So did NEC's short-lived TurboGrafx 16, and carved out a niche as the system better able to offer more authentic translations of arcade hits, but it didn't have its own Mario. In 1991, that would change. Sonic the Hedgehog, looking for all the world like an electric blue punk rock Mickey Mouse, became Sega's new mascot and the first serious contender for Mario's crown in the character's lifetime. Whereas Mario ambled through his colorful worlds, Sonic was all about speed and visceral conquest. One beat a Mario level, but one survived a Sonic level. Canny Sega made the contrast between its two characters. Sonic's edgy 90s flippancy and attitude versus Mario's old-fashioned fusion of fairy tale whimsy and working-class Americana into the driving force of an ambitious marketing blitz. The Genesis was the hip console and Nintendo was uncool. In playgrounds, arcades, and living rooms all over America, young consumers chose the sides. In those days, it was unheard of for an average kid to own two consoles, turning friend against friend, as both companies stoked the fires amid skyrocketing sales. The console wars had begun. When the smoke finally cleared over the great conflict between SNES and Genesis, Nintendo had more or less come out on top in terms of raw sales. Mario certainly had a spectacular 90s, with Yoshi's Island, Super Mario RPG, Mario Kart, a litany of cameos, and the two Super Mario Land titles on the Game Boy handheld, the latter of which would introduce the enigmatic evil doppelganger Wario to the series' mythos. But the war had taken its toll in the realm of public perception. Sega had not supplanted their rival, but they had lodged the image of Nintendo and Mario as the face of all things old-fashioned, childish, and unhip in the industry. Although Nintendo would certainly not help their case by maintaining a puritanical policy against violent or sexual content in an era where more explicit titles like Mortal Kombat and Doom were all the rage. Within the industry, Nintendo increasingly came to be viewed in much the same way that Walt Disney Studios had been in the early 80s, a powerful but stodgy relic, standing in vain against the tide of history, and much of their behavior as the 90s wore on only enforced that notion. At the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, they made an infamous public spectacle out of unexpectedly breaking a CD-ROM console-making partnership with Sony, one day after Sony had debuted the proposed device at the same show. It was here that the bigger value of Mario as an icon was coming into focus. The only conceivable way any game company could afford to conduct itself in such a way was on the strength of its first-party software, and with Mario, Nintendo held the ultimate trump card, but even he was not invincible. In 1993, Miyamoto's creation finally found a challenge he could not surmount. A live-action Super Mario Bros. Movie, made by an American film studio, was an unmitigated disaster upon its release, haunting stories of a trouble-plagued production, opening to tepid box office and horrendous reviews. At the height of Mario's popularity, it was an early sign that things were not as comfortable as they appeared. Hard times. In 1996, Mario would be the face of gaming's next evolution, once again. Super Mario 64 turned free-roaming, three-dimensional gameplay from a dream to reality, as the flagship game of the Nintendo 64 console. But while the game, and others on the system, are today remembered as an all-time classic, the waning days of the 20th century would be lean years for Mario and his makers. In 1994, Sony had become the first company to successfully enter the game console race from outside gaming with its PlayStation, a machine built from the remnants of their collaboration with Nintendo. It filled a void left by the slow-motion collapse of Sega, who were not capable of replicating the Genesis' success, and it ultimately overtook Nintendo as the top console producer. With third-party developers flocking to Sony, Nintendo was relying on its homegrown creations, such as the unexpected mega popularity of Pokemon and Mario especially. It was in this period that Mario the Icon began to more fully supplant the attendant-rich gameplay experience as the driving force behind sales and notoriety. Despite the universal acclaim for Mario 64, he wouldn't headline another full-fledged action-adventure title until Super Mario Sunshine for the GameCube, another less than financially successful console carried mainly by first-party software, in 2002. And though faltering in consoles, Nintendo remained unfailingly dominant in the world of handheld gaming. The Rebirth. By 2006, much of the games industry expected Nintendo to have fallen away like Sega and take Mario with them. Neither the N64 or the GameCube had lit up the world like the NES and SNES had, and while they remained household names, the golden age of gaming they'd been a part of was beginning to fade. One-time rival, Sonic the Hedgehog, was a shadow of his former self, and once familiar names, like Mega Man and Simon Belmont, were being supplanted by the likes of Kratos and Master Chief. The true console war of this new age was between Sony's PlayStation, about to enter its third iteration, and Microsoft's Xbox, about to launch its new 360 version. Mario had become a side player in the game it used to rule. That's what everybody thought, at least. When Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto, who had in the intervening years risen to a role of great prominence within the Nintendo corporate regime, announced they would be producing another console after the GameCube, built around a new form of interactivity rather than a major power upgrade, nobody paid much attention. A Hail Mary pass from a one-time giant, soon to fall down. No need to get excited until they saw it. The Wii was an ambitious attempt to upend the entire gaming landscape. A platform aimed not exclusively at longtime Nintendo fans, nor at the increasingly dominant 18 to 30 plus hardcore audience, but at families, ex-gamers, and even non-gamers. Built around the new style of motion sensing controllers, traditional gamers and industry insiders balked, but consumers went mad for it. All at once, Nintendo products were flying off the shelves, and the house Miyamoto built was the king again. But where was Mario? As it turned out, it was just a matter of waiting. Super Mario Galaxy, a sci-fi infused return to the 3D platforming action of Mario 64, marked a big return for the character on the Wii. It was successful enough to spawn the Mario series' first direct sequel since the original Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. All well and good, but the real return to prominence for Mario was sneaking up on people. Around the same time that the impending launch of the Wii was getting all the attention, Nintendo released New Super Mario Bros. To the DS. It was a full-scale throwback to the golden age Mario games. A side-scroller in the vein of Super Mario Bros. 1, with power-up suits and a map system like Super Mario Bros. 3. Such a thing was bound to be popular with now-grown generation NES gamers, but its sales exceeded expectations, and the reception clearly indicated that it wasn't just old fans who loved old Mario. 2 years later, Nintendo announced they would continue the series on the Wii. New Super Mario Bros. Wii would best be described as Super Mario Bros. 3, but with 4 people on the same time. Like its predecessor, everything was classic. The princess kidnapped, the culprit Bowser. Standing in your way, the Koopalings, Bowser's children. Largely absent from the series for the last several installments. That the response to the game was positive was practically a given, but the magnitude of its popularity shocked the industry. It was immediately one of the most popular Wii games to hit the market. As of 2012, has sold over 26 million copies, easily placing it amongst the best-selling games of all time. It was almost poetic. The game that firmly re-established Mario as an icon of equal relevance and presence to the modern figures was a throwback to the obsolete genre that got him here in the first place. The once-and-future king. Today, improbably, Mario has become even more ubiquitous than ever. While gamers remain bitterly divided over the relative worth and import of the Wii, it was the most visible, talked about, best-selling machine of its generation, and the magnitude of its penetration has enhanced the visibility of everything associated with it. Miyamoto, once known only to gamers, is now a celebrity, honored on Time Magazine's Top 100 Influential People list, and his creations have fared even better. The mega success of New Super Mario Bros. Wii was followed by Super Mario 3D Land and New Super Mario Bros. 2 on the 3DS, both of which were similar runaway hits, and incidentally both involved the return of much-loved elements from Super Mario Bros. 3. Mario and his friends, now with 2 generations and counting of devoted fans, are again immortalized in every form, from clothing to toys to snack food. A mom or dad can walk to a store sporting a nostalgic t-shirt referencing a Mario game they grew up with and purchase a toy for a child who's growing up with Mario now. As of this writing, Nintendo is preparing to launch the Wii U, a successor console to the original Wii. One of the prime games already slated to be amongst its premier launch titles? New Super Mario Bros. U. The console that will officially kick off the next generation of home gaming will have, as its first big showpiece, a Mario game, executed in the classic Mario style. After all these years, he still looms that large. Impressive, considering how humbly he began. No, incredible, considering how humbly I came to meet him. And now a word from our sponsors. Hey folks, are you a fan of Lars and Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Do you want to help me out somehow? If so, here's how you can give me money. You can go to patreon.com/LarsonHalleck and give me some money. Or you can donate to me via PayPal, paypal.me/LarsonHalleck. Or buy my book. Otherwise, visit my Gab, my Twitter, and keep watching the videos.